Okay, so first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to the call today. Today, we're going to be talking about the 12 business guarantees and what the Australian consumer law means to you and your client. Joining me on the line, I've got William Mulholland, who runs a legal practice here in Victoria. I met William a little time ago, and I know that he had a lot of knowledge and information around the Australian consumer law and the statutory guarantees, and it piqued my interest because I know that guarantees are a big part of marketing. So I've got William on the line today just to discuss some of the legal ramifications. I'd like to welcome William to the call. Welcome.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
Can you just start off by maybe telling us a bit about your background?
Well, my background, I've been practicing as a commercial lawyer for about 11 years now. Before that, I started off in the world of the performing arts, of all things.
Right.
So I danced around the stage for about 12 years. Then I moved into some state politics. I worked as an advisor to the leader of the Victorian opposition, John Brumby, at the time. Then I spent a few years in executive headhunting while I started studying my law degree part-time. Finished law, and I've been practicing I practiced with a high-profile entertainment commercial lawyer, and then decided to go out on my own. A bit of a renaissance journey it's been.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's really start at the start. You mentioned to me the Australian consumer law, and just if you can tell me a bit of background about what that actually is.
Right. The Australian consumer law is a new law that was introduced, and it's replaced the Trade Practices Act. It's part of the Competition and Consumer Act, Commonwealth 2010.
Okay.
And the Australian consumer law is a schedule to that new piece of legislation. So the old days of the Trade Practices Act is gone, and we've now got the Competition and Consumer Act.
Yep.
And the Australian consumer law, which we're talking about today, is a schedule to that act.
Right.
Is that great? So clearly, look, it's been the biggest change to consumer law in 35 years, and we now have a single national federal law. Right. So all the Fair Trading Acts have gone.
Yep.
In terms of each state jurisdiction. And what's interesting about this new Australian consumer law is that it captures both business-to-business transactions as well as business-to-consumer.
Okay.
So it replaces up to 20 Commonwealth and state-based acts and regulations. So they've really gone through the cupboard with a clean sweep, trying to simplify it all.
So what does it mean to the business owner?
Well, what it means to the business owner is that it's very important that they understand that all the old consumer protection laws have been repealed. It's all changed.
Yep.
We've now got a national scheme which establishes a set of statutory consumer guarantees, and we'll be talking about those shortly, as well as other laws dealing with consumer product safety.
Okay.
It commenced on the 1st of January 2011.
Yep.
And while there's been a lot of talk about broadband and carbon tax and NBN, change of leadership, a lot of people are still not really in the picture about what's happened with the Australian consumer law. Not a lot of people are up to speed on this as yet because there's been so much concentration and talk about all these other things.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a bit about sort of what does it mean? What's the overview?
Okay, well, look, there's 5 key areas of change under the Australian consumer law. We've got the 12 consumer guarantees. We'll be talking about them today.
Yep.
There's also sections dealing with unfair practices, unfair contract terms, sales practices, and product safety. We haven't got time to talk about all those, but I would like to concentrate on the first point, the 12 consumer guarantees, and just touch briefly on the unfair practices, because the unfair practices does have a link to the consumer guarantees, particularly in the area of potential fines. And we'll be talking about this. This legislation does have some teeth to it. We recently saw AGL being fined by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission under the Act for $1.1 million.
Right.
Big money, big bickies.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's go into this. Let's talk about the consumer guarantees.
Okay, well, look, some people may be scratching their head and saying, well, you know, I'm supplying my goods or services to business.
Yeah.
What does consumer law have to do with me? Well, under the Australian consumer law, it's a question of a definition. But as the slide indicates, you are a consumer when you buy any goods or services costing up to $40,000.
Okay.
That's on a per transaction basis.
Right.
So if I'm supplying my legal services to you, and you ask me to draw you a contract, if it's up to $40,000, I'd charge you only $39,000 for that contract, David. You would be a consumer under the Australian consumer law.
Right.
That's on a business-to-business transaction.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's interesting.
Okay.
So in terms of business to consumer, you are in terms of a non-business transaction, you are a consumer if you buy goods or services costing more than $40,000, which are normally used for personal, domestic, or household purposes. So if you go and buy yourself a car, brand new car, $50,000 or $60,000 car, or a caravan, for example. But what's interesting is that what's important for our business listeners is that on a per transaction basis, if you sell goods or services and it's under $40,000, then these Australian consumer law provisions are attached to you. You have to be aware of them, and you're caught by them.
Okay, so in the majority of small businesses, they would fall under this jurisdiction.
They would, and I've got clients. One of my clients works as a lighting supplier, and I asked them this very question. I said, what percentage breakdown of your client base would fall in the under 40K and over 40K?
Yeah.
And they said, about 70% would fall into under 40,000 per transaction. Okay. So I said, on that basis, then you need to be fully mindful and aware of the Australian consumer law and how it affects your business.
Okay. So let's talk about the guarantees maybe and just sort of understand what the importance of these guarantees are.
All right. Well, the guarantees are divided into goods and services. There are 9 for goods and 3 for services. And I've got them up here. So just running through them quickly. If you are supplying goods, then you provide a guarantee as a supplier that you provide clear title to the person. So if you sell a car, you've got the right to dispose of the goods, that you give them undisturbed possession, free of any undisclosed charges. So that means there's no mortgage over the goods. So if you're buying a car or a caravan or even a photocopier, that someone else hasn't got dibs on it. That they're of acceptable quality. Now, that's a term that's defined in the new Australian consumer law. Okay. And that picks up issues about safety, durability. So, for example, you buy a toaster from the local shop. Acceptable quality means it's not scratched. It means when you put in your toast, it's not going to explode and burst into flames. So it's safe, it's durable,
and it works.
That you'll guarantee the fitness for any disclosed purposes or representations. That means that if you say that this good will do something, or you make a representation on the shop floor that it will do something, then that it actually does it.
Interesting.
It also deals with supply of goods by description. Match a sample or demonstration model. So if you give a guarantee that the product on the floor or the product on the website has got a silver door and chrome buttons, then the one that you deliver matches the sample or the demo model that you've shown the consumer. This is interesting. Repair facilities and spare parts will reasonably be available. I bought a dishwasher a few years ago, Fisher & Paykel. Now, they're a New Zealand manufacturer, but there's a guarantee that they have repair facilities here in Australia. So if my dishwasher breaks down, I can get on the phone to Fisher & Paykel and they will be able to send somebody around. So I don't have to fly somebody over from New Zealand.
Yes.
And then the final guarantee relates to express warranties. So that if you give any express warranties about goods, then you've got to live up to them. So if I go and buy a car from a local dealership and I say to the person selling me the car, I want this car to tow a 20-metre boat, and this person who sells it to me says, well, I'll give you a warranty that this car will tow the 20-metre boat. Well, that's a consumer guarantee.
Right. So basically anything that the salesperson promises at the time of sale would fall under express warranties?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And there are consequences that flow if any of these consumer guarantees are breached.
So it's interesting. So really what we're saying is that basically any product you buy has these statutory guarantees that are implied, whether there is any written guarantee or non-written guarantee.
Exactly. These 9 consumer guarantees apply to the sale of any goods or services to a consumer.
Right.
And that consumer is defined as anybody up to 40,000 and over 40,000 if it's for normal domestic household purposes.
Right.
That's why business needs to be aware of this, because most small businesses, as we've mentioned, supply in the space of 40,000 per transaction or less.
Right. I think one of the things you're probably aware of is that we use guarantees a lot from a coaching perspective. When I'm teaching people how to market their business, we say, look, put some guarantees in place, which actually demonstrate that you stand behind your product. Now, what you're suggesting here is by law we stand behind our product anyway.
Yes, and services too, which we'll be talking about shortly.
Sure, and then once we do that, what we really need to do is put it in writing, because what it really does is just gives people a feeling of comfort when dealing with us. Now, anyone who knows the law knows that the representation or whatever goes on in the transaction is already covered. But when the company actually stipulates it up front, it actually adds value to the transaction as well.
It certainly does.
Great.
Certainly
Great.
does.
So maybe let's move on to the service guarantees as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I just want to have one quick mention about the new warranty against defects in relation to goods. Now, if any listeners are in the business of supplying goods, there's a new mandatory text that came into effect on the 1st of January 2012.
Yep.
And for example, now if you buy, I bought a new DVD player the other day from Dick Smith.
Yep.
Increasingly, you will see these warranty against defects, and this wording, which appears on this slide now, is mandatory, and you'll see it more and more anytime you buy a fridge or a dishwasher, caravan, and that wording there says that our goods come with guarantees that cannot be excluded under Australian consumer law, and that's one of the big takeouts of today's webinar, is that you can't exclude these guarantees, and they started on the 1st of January 2011. In terms of both goods and services. So let's have a look at the consumer guarantees for services. Well, there are 3 guarantees, 9 for goods, 3 for services. And I'm in the service game, and so are you. So we guarantee to provide services with due care and skill that will be fit for the purpose and within a reasonable time if no time is set. So what does it mean, due care and skill? Well, if I hire someone to paint my house, before they start the job as a painter, they've got to remove the old flaking paint and prepare the paint so that when they paint, it's not going to flake off. So that's an example of due care and skill. For a lawyer, if you come to me then and engage me as your lawyer to provide you with legal services, then I have to provide those services with the due care and skill of a lawyer. And that would include that if I don't practice in family law, then I shouldn't be providing you any legal advice in family law. I should refer you to a family lawyer.
So what you're saying is if someone makes a promise to deliver something that they actually really aren't clear that they can deliver, then the consumer can claim under this due care and skill.
Well, exactly. It's all about talking about the level of expertise that somebody brings to the table. Okay, let's talk about the guarantee about being fit for a particular purposes. If you provide the guarantee that services will be reasonably fit for any purpose specified by the consumer. And the example I've got here is that if I go to a laser surgeon and say I want to be able to drive without glasses, I specify that. That's the purpose that I want. Then if the surgeon says, yes, I'll provide those services, and you will be able to drive without glasses. So that's a guarantee, that the guarantee has been given in relation to the particular purpose. So again, in the example of the legal game, if you come to me and you say, well, the purpose is I want to solve these legal problems, certainly that's the purpose that we'll strive to do. And what's interesting is that this needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. If I came to you and said, David, I want you to coach me so that my business turns over $100 million in a year's time, I don't think that would be so binding as I just want to improve my business. And the third guarantee for services is it must be supplied within a reasonable time if no time is set. So normally a contract will provide will stipulate when the services are provided. If the contract doesn't, then the supplier guarantees that the services will be supplied within a reasonable time. And reasonable is on this case-by-case basis. So the time to build a house will differ from the time to prepare the tax return or draft a contract.
So how does someone stipulate reasonable time?
Well, they don't. And this would be a matter that if it went before a judge or a tribunal, the person listening to or determining the dispute would take it on a case-by-case basis. It's an objective standard. And to say that, look, what would be reasonable for building a house? A year, 2 years, 3 years, versus the time for getting a tax return. Well, you'd hope to get your tax return done in a month or two. If you ask me to draft a contract, maybe 1 or 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It depends on the nature of the service as to what's reasonable. So they're the 3 guarantees applying to services.
Okay, so really those 12 consumer guarantees, they sound pretty straightforward. It's basically saying the way you represent your product is the way it needs to be delivered. It needs to be provided in good condition. If there's anything that's not correct about the product or the delivery of the product or something wrong with the type of people that you've employed, I've got now a claim.
That's right. Yeah. And we're going to talk about, so these 12 guarantees exist, but what happens when goods or services do not meet a guarantee?
Yeah.
When it falls short. And this is where the law kicks in. If goods or services supplied by a supplier do not meet one of these 12 guarantees, then the consumer has a right to a remedy. Okay. Now, the remedy depends on whether you've got a major or a minor problem, big or little. And the consumer, under the law, can claim a remedy from the supplier of the goods or services, the manufacturer of the goods. And there's also a provision there for consequential loss, which is a legal term which states that a consumer can seek compensation for loss or damage resulting from a failure to meet a guarantee. Right. An example I've got here is you buy a toaster. It's a faulty toaster, sets fire to the house, house burns down.
Yeah.
Not only are you entitled to claim for a new toaster, you're also entitled to claim for the consequential loss arising from the breach of that consumer guarantee. So, and that all makes sense. Yeah. It's not dodgy there. So the question of these consumer guarantees, and a lot of people, I think, in the consumer space are always mindful of when they can get a repair, a replacement, or a refund. Yeah. So if you've breached a consumer guarantee, it depends on whether the failure of one of these guarantees is major or minor. If it's major, for an example of goods, the consumer doesn't keep the goods and chooses a refund or replacement, or keeps the goods and gets compensation for drop in value. If it's minor, then the supplier chooses whether to give a refund, replacement, or repair, or to fix the problem. So you can take the toaster back, the faulty toaster, and they'll give you a new one that's not faulty, rather than giving you a refund. So there's a few options there, depending on whether it's major or minor. And I'll say this for the listeners from the business to consumer perspective. There's a wonderful app that you can download. It's a free app put out by Consumer Affairs Victoria. It's called My Shop Rights. Right. And that's a summary of these Australian consumer law when you're out shopping. Okay. So it's a great app. I've got it on my phone, My Shop Rights, free app from Consumer Affairs Victoria, which is a good summary of these consumer guarantees. From the
so it really just allows you to determine what sort of guarantees are in place, even though they're not worded or they're not verbalised by the shop that you're in or by the people you're transacting with.
Exactly. And if you get into an argument with a shop assistant on the floor, you can just pull out the app and run them through it, which can be very handy at times.
Okay.
Talking about services, again, in terms of if there's a failure of the consumer guarantee in relation to the provision or supply of services, if it's a major failure, then the consumer can cancel the contract and get a refund, keep the contract and get compensation. Or if it's a minor failure, then the supplier chooses whether to give a refund, replacement, or repair. But the consumer must give the supplier a chance to fix the problem free of charge and within a reasonable time. Right. So,
look, I suppose I'm just hearing that there's nothing really new in these expectations. If I'm a consumer, I would expect that. The reason I actually asked you to come on today was to actually highlight to the business owners that are listening that these guarantees are in place.
They are in place from 1st of January 2011.
But the last thing you'd want to do is have a consumer pull you up on what your guarantees are.
Exactly.
So probably it makes a lot of sense for the business owner to know exactly where they stand, to actually understand what they're already guaranteeing, so that they can actually move forward on their front foot and actually, even as a part of doing business with the consumer, stipulate the guarantees up front.
Exactly. And one of the takeouts, certainly from a lawyer's perspective, is that we have been doing a lot of work with our clients in revising, amending and changing all their terms and conditions documents, because terms and conditions documents are the contractual interface between you and your client base. Yeah. And since the 1st of January 2011, you have to get your terms and conditions rewritten, because any reference to the Trade Practices Act and certain clauses that used to be standard boilerplate clauses need to go.
Okay.
And there are consequences from not having your terms and conditions looked at. So that's something I want to talk about at the end of the presentation.
Sure.
So we covered the issue of whether it's a major or a minor failure of the guarantee. But what is a major failure? Because that's the next question. So you're entitled to certain remedies depending on whether it's a major or a minor failure, big or small.
So how would you do? How would you? What is a major failure?
What is a major failure? Well, a major failure is defined under the Act, under the schedule. So a major failure is defined as one where a reasonable consumer would not have bought the service or the goods if they'd known the nature and extent of the problem. So, for example, if you had laser surgery and 12 months later you needed glasses or contact lenses, that would be considered a major failure.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that Tiger Woods, for example, he has had laser surgery in both eyes.
Yeah.
He had that done about 6 years ago. You don't see Tiger Woods wearing glasses on the golf course.
Right.
And that was what he wanted it for. He wanted to be able to play golf without glasses. Now, if he'd had that surgery and 12 months later he needed contacts or glasses, that would have been a major failure, and he would have been able to go back to the surgeon. Well, it would be pretty hard to undo it, so we would have got compensation.
Right.
For another example here, for terms of goods, if you buy a washing machine and if you knew it was going to burn out after 3 months, so if you as the supplier knew that the washing machine really wasn't going to last more than 3 months because you'd found a dodgy manufacturer, that would be a major failure of a consumer guarantee.
Okay, so really, like, and what comes to mind is a lot of these freshly imported no-name brand household goods.
That's right.
Which are really coming in very cheaply. You know, you can pay $9 for a drill down at Bunnings these days.
Well, that's right.
So the question is, when we look at the drill that's $9, and what's a reasonable amount of time something like that's expected to last?
Well, again, this is something that it's not defined in the Australian consumer law. What's reasonable will be looked at in the circumstances on a case-by-case basis. So using your example, I go down to Bunnings and I see a drill that costs me $3 or a drill that costs me $60.
Yeah.
If I buy a $3 drill, then what's reasonable for me to expect the lifetime of that drill to be? A month, 2 months, 6 jobs. But if I buy the $60 or $80 or $100 drill, then I'd expect a longer life.
Right.
And that would be reasonable in those circumstances. So the choice is, if you buy a low quality, low price product, then you'd expect it's a bit of a throwaway society.
Okay, so really, like, even in this situation, if someone's buying a discounted, like a cheapy product, they can't expect it to still have the same level of statutory warranty as a high price product.
Well, that would be taken, again, I can only just refer people back to what's in the Australian consumer law.
Yeah.
Whether a reasonable consumer would have bought that service or good if they'd known the nature and extent of the problem.
Right.
So a $3 drill versus a $60 drill.
Yeah.
There's the old adage: you get what you pay for in life.
Okay.
But what is a major failure is defined in terms of this wording.
What's reasonable. Okay, so reasonable consumer.
Other examples of a major failure is a significant departure from the description, sample, or demonstration model.
Yeah.
And I could use the example of a dishwasher. You see the sample model on the website. Yeah. It's stainless steel door with shiny knobs, and the one they deliver you is white plastic. Okay. That's a major failure.
Yeah. Okay.
Because that's a significant departure from the description or sample model.
Right.
Another example is a defect that cannot be fixed easily or within a reasonable time.
Yep.
Or in the example of where a supplier of a service created an unsafe situation.
Yeah.
And that would be an example of an electrician incorrectly wiring wall sockets in your house.
Right.
So you might pay a Sparky $250 to put in 3 or 4 new sockets. If they're wired incorrectly, creates an unsafe situation. That's a major failure, and the consumer, I would be entitled to a full refund.
Yeah.
If I found out that some of those sockets were sparking, because that could create a situation where the house could burn down.
Okay.
Clearly a major failure.
So let's talk about the instances where a supplier may not have to give a refund.
Well, there are examples under the Australian consumer law where the supplier did not meet a consumer guarantee due to something beyond human control. And this is the old force majeure type situations, act of God, hurricanes, lockouts, strikes.
Right, so something that's not directly associated with the product or the service that stops the service or product delivering what it's supposed to, that then is considered not part of the guarantee.
Exactly. So, for example, in my case, if I was engaged to appear in a court in Sydney for a day and there was a plane strike, then that would not be a major failure because there's something beyond my control in terms of the provision of those services. If the consumer leaves it too long to complain about the goods or service, then the supplier may not have to give a refund or replacement. So if I engage you to provide me with some coaching services and I come back to you in 2022 and say, David, it didn't work out for me. And you say, well, look, you've left it a bit late. It's been over 7, 6, 8 years. Yeah. So don't leave it too long to complain about the goods or service.
Okay, so there is a time limit for the ability to claim as well.
Exactly. Yep. If the consumer lost, destroyed, or damaged or disposed of the goods, or the goods are attached to other property and can't be removed without damage. An example there is wallpaper.
Yeah.
So you say you can't just rip the wallpaper off the wall and say, look, this wallpaper's dodgy. I want a refund for the whole lot.
Okay.
So that's there are some exceptions there where a supplier may not have to give a refund or replacement in the event of a major failure.
Okay, so let's talk about when these guarantees don't apply.
Well, clearly you must not. And this is a supplier of goods or services. You must not ask the consumer to sign away their rights.
Right.
You must not do that. And there's a big kicker in the legislation about this.
Okay.
Also, you must not give false or misleading information about these consumer guarantees, nor should you as a supplier try to limit or exclude these 12 guarantees. And that's where the wording of your terms and conditions or anything on your website or what your salespeople are doing on the floor, it's very important that business owners get up to speed with these 9 goods guarantees, 3 service guarantees, so that their people know what they're doing, so they're not liable.
Yeah, fantastic.
And this takes us into the other section of the Australian consumer law, and that is the unfair practices. Now, the unfair practices applies to any person in trade or commerce. Now, in the old days, under the Trade Practices Act, it was just about a corporation, and the Fair Trading Act dealt with people, persons. But now we've got one unified law which deals with a person, and a person includes a company or an individual.
Right. And what's an unfair practice?
Well, an unfair practice is there's a shopping list. There's 14 examples of unfair practices set out in the
so just if you're going to try and summarise that, what would someone be looking for as an unfair practice? What would a business owner be looking at?
Well, if you did, an unfair practice would be a false or misleading representation about the standard quality or value of a good or service. If you gave a false testimonial. Right. So, for example, if I had on my website that, Paul Hogan thought I was the best entertainment commercial lawyer in the world. Yeah. But if Paul Hogan never used me and I was giving a false testimonial, that's an unfair practice. Right. Whether the goods or services have sponsorship or approval. So if I said Ian Thorpe sponsored, has approved of my legal services, or it's got the sponsorship of the Australian Olympic Committee, that would be another example of an unfair practice.
If it wasn't true.
If it wasn't true. Right. The place of origin of goods.
Okay.
That's another example of an unfair practice. If I said to you that the goods was imported came from the best crystal glass manufacturer in Switzerland, but actually it was coming, from Elstonwick around the corner.
So essentially, it's out and out lying.
False and misleading representation. Got it. You can also make a supplier can also make a false and misleading representation about the need for any goods or services. Okay. So this catches those people that say you must use my services, otherwise your business will fail within a week. Okay. That's another false and misleading representation, which under the shopping list constitutes an unfair practices.
I notice you mentioned price there as well. Let's just talk a little bit about price as an unfair practice. How does that play out?
Well, again, if you make a false or misleading representation about a price, so if you nominate, if I said to you, well, I will charge you $300 for this contract, and then you say, okay, we'll go ahead. But then halfway through I said, but the contract's got an appendix, so that's going to cost you another $50.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, there's an execution clause in there, so that's going to cost you another $25.
Right.
So if you're making a false and misleading representation about the price,
okay,
and you're sort of leveraging it up, wedging it up,
yeah,
or making some sort of puffery about the price, then it's an unfair practice.
Understand.
Now, here's the kicker in the unfair practices, is that there's a prohibition on any supplier, any person supplying goods or services who makes a false or misleading representation about the existence or the effect of any condition, warranty, guarantee, right or remedy, including a consumer guarantee.
So what does that mean?
That means that a supplier of goods or services to a consumer cannot make a false representation about these consumer guarantees.
Right.
You cannot go to the shopping list of these 12 guarantees and start playing around with them. You can't have in your terms and conditions, for example, on your website or on the back of your invoice, wording which in effect tries to reduce the rights or the remedies or misinforms your client, a consumer, about their 12 consumer guarantees.
Right.
And the real kicker here is that this is the nexus between the consumer guarantees and unfair practices provisions of the new law.
Right.
Because that creates the opportunity for you to be exposed to a penalty. And the penalties for an unfair practice, such as making false statements about a consumer guarantee, well, for a company, it can be up to $1.1 million.
Right.
And for a person, an individual, sole trader, $220,000. Okay. I don't know about you, but if that was me, that would punch a big hole in my revenue figures for the year if I got fined the maximum fine. And the maximum penalty for making a false or misleading representation about a consumer guarantee is $1.1 million or $220,000 for an individual. That's why business owners need to get on top of this.
Yeah. Okay. So really, what we're saying is that these guarantees are all in place. We can't exclude ourselves from these guarantees, and any representation we make to exclude ourselves can put us in the firing line.
Exactly.
Of these penalties. But on the other side of that, we can actually use them as our bedrock, as our base guarantee, and we can add on top of those.
We certainly can. We certainly can.
Yeah, fantastic.
So look, and how this sort of plays out in terms of my work and the work that I do for clients is, as I've mentioned, I think it's very important for everybody to have their terms and conditions looked at.
Yeah.
So that to ensure that they're sailing within the boundary of the 12 consumer guarantees that we've talked about today.
Sure.
And that they're not stepping into the danger zone of using old terms and conditions, which use the old wording from the old Trade Practices Act, which had limitation of liability clauses. We call them boilerplate clauses, where a lawyer would draft that the person was not liable for anything, including the damage to the kitchen sink. Well, those days have all gone now.
Right.
And that's why business needs to have all these documents looked at, terms and conditions, and the information they're putting on their website. And as you mentioned, this bedrock of these consumer guarantees, which can be added to as long as you comply with them.
Yeah.
But they exist now, whether listeners or whether a supplier of goods or services is aware, because the old adage is true. Ignorance of the law is no defence.
Okay.
Ignorance of the law is no defence. These statutory consumer guarantees kicked off on the 1st of January 2011. They're here, they're in operation. And we've already seen some of the penalty provisions in other areas being used, for example, with the recent ACL decision with the door-to-door salespeople.
So can you tell us a bit more about what happened there?
Well, what happened there was that there were some false and misleading representations being made by door-to-door salesmen. One person in particular, through an agency that ACL used, they were dancing the person taking them on a merry dance in terms of what they were actually selling them. This was reported to the ACCC, and I think, given that this is such fresh legislation, it's only been around since 2011, we've seen a few test cases, and certainly this case involving AGL was under the deceptive misleading conduct provision of the Competition and Consumer Act, and also unfair practices. Mm-hmm. So that's already happened. AGL has had to cough up a fine of $1.1 million.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are going to be more cases down the track, particularly in relation to these statutory consumer guarantees.
Right.
Let's just hope it's not you or me or any of the listeners today.
Well, let's hope not. But I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Is having the legal terms and conditions of a company looked at on a regular basis. Just really scanned over to make sure that there's nothing in there that's actually either meaningless
or unfair.
The second side of it, and this is probably more from the marketing side, is making sure that any guarantees that we do represent to the market we can honour, so that we're very clear. And I think the interesting thing is it's always a double-edged sword, because some people like to hide as much as they can of these statutory guarantees, fearing that people would claim on them. But I see it the other way and saying, well, it's a marketing opportunity. If you're willing to stand behind your statutory guarantees and not say these are the statutory guarantees, just say these are the guarantees that we offer.
That's right.
And we offer satisfaction that if you're not satisfied with the delivery of our product or service, we'll either replace it or refund your money in full. Anything that doesn't deliver as promised, we will gladly change over. And people are really getting a sense of comfort when they're working with you, as opposed to a sense of, I just wonder whether this is going to be represented the way I expect.
Exactly. You bet.
So can I ask you, because we've talked a lot about what the statutory guarantees are and the legal side. So let's say I'm working with a client and we're talking about guarantees. And usually when we talk about guarantees, we go above and beyond the statutory, and we say, look, what is the thing that scares people the most when buying your product or service? And usually that's where we'll drill in with the guarantee. And an example is we did some work with a photographer up in Queensland, and he was a wedding photographer. And we wanted to actually create a point of difference in his product. And we said, what's the thing that the consumer fears the most? And he said, well, the bride's biggest fear is that she's not happy with the photos or they don't turn out. Now, under the statutory guarantee, they already have a right to claim. Because if it's not what was expected, if someone says, we'll do great photos of your wedding and the photos don't turn out, we don't have to pay. Is that correct?
Well, it goes back to those three guarantees, because what we're talking about here is services.
That's right.
In that example. So we go back to the three guarantees for services.
Yeah.
And we see how it just stacks up in the example there.
Yeah.
Because there is a subjective element there about what may or not be a good photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where any judge or tribunal member would take it on a case-by-case basis. But so let's go back. The consumer guarantees for services. The photographer guarantees to provide the services with due care and skill.
Yep.
That will be fit for the purpose and within a reasonable time if no time is set.
Okay, so they've met that if the photos are produced.
That's right.
But if the quality isn't satisfactory, that's really not covered by this consumer guarantee.
Well, if the quality is not satisfactory, then it goes to the question of whether that quality represents a major or a minor failure. Mm-hmm. And that would then be determined under the area that we covered before and what's a major or a minor failure.
Yep.
And that is whether a reasonable consumer, knowing about that failure, would have purchased that service.
Yeah.
And that gives the right to the remedy. So
what we did anyway with this guy is we took it a step forward and said, well, that's their biggest fear, that they don't turn out. So what can we guarantee? And he said, well, I'd be happy to guarantee that they're satisfied, or I'll reshoot the wedding for them. Now, this is above and beyond any statutory guarantee. And that was because just giving a refund to a bride if her photos don't turn out is not satisfactory.
Because the opportunity's been missed.
Right?
The day's gone.
And, even though in Australia you get probably 2 chances at a wedding, according to statistics.
That's right.
Usually the first one is the one that you want to get the photos of. So his big thing was, look, they fear the photos not turning out, but the biggest problem is once the opportunity's gone, it's gone. So he offered to reshoot the whole photo shoot of the wedding at no charge, including paying for any international guests that have to come back to the country, any hire of any halls or formal wear. And we did the numbers on this because with these sorts of guarantees, it's about risk mitigation.
Mm.
And he said, well, how on average, and we looked at his history of weddings, and he said, on average, the number of international visitors is usually limited to 1 or 2, which meant maximum he could be up maybe for $2,000 or $4,000 in flights. If you have to hire a wedding hall for an hour or two to take a photo shoot, maybe a few $100s. Same with a limo, same with the formal wear. So he said, worst case scenario, I might be up for $5,000 or $6,000. Now, if she's really unhappy with the photos that we've taken in the first place, first of all, she's never going to refer me to anyone. And second of all, if anything, she's actually going to detract from my name in the marketplace. So he said, I can charge a lot more for someone if I offer that level of guarantee. So we're taking the guarantee up a notch and saying, well, let's cover that as well. So really, he's gone well and truly above and beyond his consumer minimums.
That's right, that bedrock, these 12 statutory consumer guarantees.
And it just gave him the ability to charge as much as he wanted. So I think really one of the keys here is, the bedrock is there and we shouldn't be fearful of it. We should actually be making sure that we're providing it that as a minimum. And if we can go beyond that, we can start making a point of difference in the marketplace, being quite safe and comfortable, knowing that we're not going to get into any legal ramification if we're already offering a guarantee on our front foot.
That's right. Exactly. And look, I think the motivation behind the new Australian consumer law, and this had the agreement, this had bipartisan support between both sides of politics, was that they wanted to clean up the old wording, make it plain English, put it in more simple, accessible terms, and so that people understand and codify what these 12 consumer guarantees are. And as long as you do the right thing, as a supplier of goods or services, or as a consumer, if you know your rights, then I think people will be in a better position all round. The example was I was at outdoor shop 6 months ago, and I wanted to buy some boots. And some hiking boots, and I went up to the shop assistant and I said, well, these look pretty good hiking boots. Are they waterproof? And she said, yes, I'll check, but I think they are waterproof. And then she came back to me and said, I've just found out they are waterproof. I said, so now you are giving me an express warranty, which represents a consumer guarantee that these boots are waterproof. And if I go out and take them and splash around in the puddle and my feet get wet, I can come back and get a replacement or a refund under the Australian consumer law. She said, yes, sir, you can.
Wow.
So obviously that retail chain had fully informed their staff about this new law. And I think the Australian Retail Association has been very active, particularly in the retail space, to inform all their members so that all shops know that these new laws apply and what their effect is, particularly for the people on the shop floor who are giving express warranties, which create consumer guarantee obligation.
Fantastic. So really, we can use it in our favour.
We can use it in our favour as long as we back them up.
Right. So what we do is we train our staff to say everything you say, you will be held accountable to.
That's right.
And so don't promise things we can't deliver.
Exactly.
And so it's actually a win-win situation.
And look, that's the way commerce should be conducted.
Exactly.
Yeah. And if it is conducted in that way, then there's no need for any lawyers, which, shock horror, puts me out of a job. But that's the ideal scenario, and unfortunately in the legal area, I'm often dealing with less than ideal scenarios. People get into problems, they're not aware of the law. As I mentioned, ignorance of the law is no defence, and that's why in terms of my sort of summary call to action, I just talk about what I'd say that are 9 steps. And the first step is to see a good lawyer. The second is to be aware of the new Australian consumer law and the consumer guarantees.
Right.
As a lawyer, as a client, you don't have to be an expert in this area. Let the lawyer worry about all the fine detail. Go and see a good lawyer. Review your terms and conditions documents, including all your consumer contracts.
Right.
And if you don't want to do it, then I'm sure there's a good lawyer around the corner who will do it for you. There you go. See a good lawyer. See a pattern emerging here. Be aware of the remedies under the Australian consumer law, unfair practices and unfair contracts. This could apply to your business. Now, there is a carrot and there's a stick. And the stick in this legislation is the fines. The carrot is for everyone to be aware, and we'll all get on, and trade and commerce will be conducted along the lines everyone would expect.
Right.
But the stick is the fines of 1.1 million for a body corporate, or 220,000 if you're a sole trader. See a good lawyer. The golden rule of commercial law that I sort of came up with a few years ago is help me dollars are always cheaper than fix me dollars. So getting your advice, getting your terms and conditions looked at is a lot cheaper than having to deal with a claim from the ACCC.
Yeah.
Or somebody taking you off to court suing you for consequential loss because of the breach of a consumer guarantee.
Because isn't it true? Most people only go to a lawyer when they need them.
Well, that's right. And that's called fix me dollars.
Right.
And they get very annoyed and cross with lawyers because they cost so much money, but that's because they're involved in court proceedings and they've lost control.
Yeah.
As soon as you're in court, then there's a third person in the room, a third party, and that party's the judge. It's the court, and they get to set the tune. They get to dictate how it proceeds.
Right.
And I've been in court before a judge, and the judge has said to me, I don't care what you two lawyers have agreed, this is the way we're going to do it because this is my courtroom, it's not a sausage factory.
Okay.
So you lose control, and that's where the costs mount up because there are steps that have to be followed in the court.
I understand.
And if you follow those tips, those 9 steps call to action, then you can be alarmed, you can maybe go off and see a good movie and relax.
Right. Okay, so really simply, I suppose what you're saying is that sometimes it's better to get advice up front. Make sure that you know where you stand, you know what you can and can't promise, you know what the consumer's rights are. You can even add on top of that, so you can put some extra guarantees on top. And so as long as you understand where you stand, you're safe. And the other thing is just to make sure that those T's and C's are checked out.
Exactly.
And a little bit of I suppose work up front can save us a lot of money down the track.
That's right. And also, I think one of the other takeouts from today's webinar is that it's very important that any supplier of goods or services, such as you and me, that we know who our consumers are.
Right.
And that's the definition of the consumer is up to $40,000 per transaction, which captures a lot of small businesses in the B2B space, in the business-to-business space. So that's why these Australian consumer laws apply not only to us when we go out shopping for white goods and our normal domestic products, but it also applies to business in a business-to-business context when it's on a per transaction basis of up to 40,000.
Okay. Now, look, for some of the people on the call or some of the people that will be listening to this webinar afterwards, are they able to contact you just to sort of get some preliminary?
Oh, certainly. And I'm more than happy to give up to half an hour free advice.
Right.
And I have a website. My website's www.wmulholland.com.au, and I already have put in place a wording which is very similar to the service guarantees under the Australian Consumer Law.
Oh,
that's the 3-step legal guarantee that I provide, which is entirely consistent with the consumer guarantees now appearing under the Australian Consumer Law.
Fantastic. Look, I suppose is there any sum up statements that you'd like to make, just helping people understand how to decide what to do next?
Well, I think the most important thing is that you don't have to be an expert in the Australian consumer law. You can spend hours reading it on the web.
Yeah.
I mean, it is drafted in plain English, but I think it's just for everybody to be mindful of what these Australian consumer law and these consumer guarantees are. Get your terms and conditions looked at and any other material that appears on your website, and be alert, don't be alarmed, to paraphrase John Howard. And if you put in place and you conduct your business along proper commercial lines and you're aware of these Australian consumer law provisions, then I think you'll be okay.
Fantastic. All right, well, look, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. It's been a bit insightful, I think, for some people, and probably a little bit alarming. But,
it's scary for some, but
I suppose knowing your rights is better than being oblivious.
Exactly. And as I said, ignorance of the law is no defence, so we've all got to get on top of this.
Fair enough. Look, thanks very much for your time again today, and we look forward to hearing back from you another time.
Thanks, David. Thank you.
Cheers.